This is the backbone of the American historical profession, these local history organizations and communities. This is where democracy happens. And this is where we learn about other cultures and learn about other people. That's what the humanities is. And that's what I have dedicated my life to, is the study of the humanities. And I've been really fortunate because I've done that outside of the academic environment for the most part. I want to talk today about the humanities and how it manifested itself into Play All Night. This is what I call Kenneth Burke's Unending Conversation. It's a concept that I learned my very first semester in grad school, 1997. And the idea is, Kenneth Burke is a philosopher. I haven't really studied anything more about him. But the idea is that we are engaged in an unending conversation at all times, particularly when it comes to the humanities and or knowing or discovering about other people, other ideas, other culture, etc. The idea is that the discussion began well before we got here, and it continues well after we're gone. So I approach this talk as if it was the unending conversation. I'll throw some ideas out at you that my hope is that you will take those, and whether you read the book is for sale, $25. I will sign the book for you before you go. It makes an awesome Christmas present, makes awesome gifts. And the book is really how I do my thing. I thank you guys for the honorarium, and honorariums are great, but the book is how really people like me make the money. It's how I cover my gas mileage and those sorts of things. So there's my pitch. I'll do it again at the end, I promise. So there's a lot of ways that I could introduce this story, and I'm gonna do it. One of the ways I could have done it is I could have given you some album covers to look at. Y'all can open them up. I mean, they're there to be explored. I chose not to unframe this one, but this is the album that I wrote the book about at Fillmore. Who has this record, by the way? If you want to. Or Duane and Gregg Allman were born in Nashville. They were born in what was St. Thomas Hospital at the time. Their father was murdered. He was a D-Day veteran, was murdered by a drifter. Their mother, Geraldine, sent them away. Where? Castle Heights Military Academy. Where is that in relation to where I'm standing right now? It's that way, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's yours truly. The last time I was up here when I spoke actually at Cumberland University, and I took myself a little photograph there. This was a miserable experience for Duane and Gregg Allman. I'm going to read a quote from another book, not my book, on when they came to Castle Heights. The day Geraldine packed up the boys and drove them to Castle Heights is one that Gregg never forgot. As an adult, he could still recall the sinking feeling deep in his stomach and the body-shaking fear that made him weep uncontrollably. He was too young to understand. All Gregg knew was that he had no daddy. Now his mama was leaving him too. As his mother pulled away, Gregg sprinted after her until the car was out of sight. I imagine, sort of running this way. That's how I've always imagined it, sort of running out, she's going to the highway. Duane bravely stood his ground and stoically watched his little brother. Gregg slowly walked back to Duane, tears streaming down his cheeks. Duane said nothing. Instead, he reached out, put his arm around Gregg's shoulder, and he squeezed as tightly as he could. Duane and Gregg hated military school. Life was regimented, up at the crack of dawn, classes all day, uniforms and marches. It was rough, Gregg said. I was in the 3rd grade, and the first day I was there, I think I learned every cuss word. I thought, Lord, what have I done to get thrown into this place? I could also talk about Bradley's barn, which I don't know where that is in relation to here. Is it that way? I know it's that way also. Thank you very much. It's derelict now. It's no longer being used.
The barn itself is gone.
The barn is gone?
Nice brick building there now.
Okay. Thank you for that.
I live right by it.
All right. So y'all know Owen Bradley's barn. The reason that's here, right, is because he made the deal in Nashville. He had to be 30 miles away from Nashville in order to record. I think it's like 30 miles on the dot. But the reason I bring this up is Duane and Gregg Allman were from Daytona Beach, Florida. And when you're from the South in this era, all of your opportunities are mostly out of the South, especially as a musician. Your first stop, though, for the most part, is Nashville, because that's your southern stop. But that is also the home of country music. Now, Duane and Gregg come up here. They get discovered by John D. Loudermilk, very famous songwriter at the time. And Loudermilk kind of takes him under his wing, helps them with songwriting, and gets them not only recording out at Bradley's barn, but also on Dial Records, Buddy Killen's Dial Records, actually, which I think was out of Gallatin. And so they recorded a single here in 1966. It flopped. And that was pretty much the end of their stint here in Nashville. The band broke up after that. They ended up moving out to LA, different band, Hourglass, which I may or may not get to today, just given time. And I could talk about the album, which is sitting there. And I can and will talk about this album, actually. This is the breakthrough record at Fillmore East when the Allman Brothers recorded it. Had they not had this record and had it not been successful, we would not be having any discussion today. I don't think anybody would really care. It was a super underground story at the first place. Now, what I won't focus on is why everybody's laughing due to what Duane Allman is holding in his hands. Anybody know? He scored a little bit of cocaine in the middle of the visit. Yes. Okay. I might conjure up some Southern Gothic imagery. Rose Hill Cemetery is an absolutely beautiful spot in Macon, right along the Ocmulgee River. It is the site of images. If the one album cover, that album cover there on that back cover, if you can hold it up real quick, that back cover image there comes from Rose Hill Cemetery. So they're actually standing in a crypt there. This is the final resting place now of 4 Allman Brothers members. There were only 2 there for a long time. This is yours truly standing in that same spot in 1997. And I say this, I want to bring it back home. That shirt is the first Allman Brothers shirt I ever bought in my life. And it has been immortalized in a t-shirt quilt that my daughter now uses. She took my t-shirt quilt a long time ago and did it. So circle stays unbroken there just a little bit. I wore this shirt, by the way, at every concert I attended for like 10 years. I could talk about my folks. This is Pat and Susie Beatty. They have 12 years. Mom died in 2012. Dad died in 2014. But when I think about being here and making the transition from like researcher, scholar to a writer, or from research to presenting the story, I think about my parents and their precision in language, honing the craft of how you speak, the words that you say, the choice of your words. And the other one I say is my dad was an attorney. And when your dad's an attorney, it's really hard to lie. At least it was really hard for me to lie. Okay, but we're really going to start where my journey started, which was at the Martin County Public Library. This was 1985. So we're talking, 39 years ago, I guess. I was given a paper. I was given a 45-page research assignment in 7th grade. I know. I don't understand it either. It never made any sense to me, and still to this day it doesn't. I wrote it by hand, and I wrote it in really big letters. I do remember that, right? Because you want to fill this up. But here's the thing. 1985, I was a 7th grader. I was a nerd, and I was playing music. And I'd been fascinated by guitar. I was a guitarist. And my father had this record, Jimi Hendrix's Are You Experienced? And it was a real outlier in the collection. My parents listened to like Ian and Sylvia and Bill Monroe, and Mom had a lot of Beatles records too, but it was like really folky, bluesy stuff. And then Dad had this weird record. Mom had Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. You know that record? Okay, I mean, they do fit. This is just a little bit harder rocking. Now, I'll tell you, when I looked at this record, I remember thinking, I don't know if I am experienced, but I'm pretty sure if I listen to this record, I'm going to get experienced, right? So really, records and music always grabbed me. And it looked like a really good time. And then I needed a topic for my paper, and I was like, okay, I'll do music. I literally have been doing music scholarship since I was in 7th grade in some way, shape, or form. I put it away for a long period of time, and I focused on more academic or seemingly academic pursuits. But at this stage, it has stuck with me that this has been going on since this. And here's what happened. I went into the public library. Huzzah for public libraries, one of the greatest inventions in American history, if you ask me. I went to the stacks. We still had card catalogs back then. And I got a bound volume. I don't even know how I found it, of Time Magazine. And this issue of Time Magazine that was in it. And what it was it's the hippies, philosophy of the subculture. My 7th grade mind combining pictures of Jimi Hendrix and the wonderful music coming out and these incredible pictures. Remember, Time had some gorgeous color photographs back in the day. And it just absolutely captivated me. And that paper doesn't survive. But those ideas sparked in me why I'm here. And it started in a 7th grade classroom in the public library in little tiny Stuart, Florida. Anybody know Stuart? Nice, thank you very much. And one thing I've learned from that effort in pursuing music is the sense of music as a collective. And I've been chasing that my entire life. Now, I discovered the Allman Brothers Band in 1992. And listen, discovered means the Allman Brothers were always in my life. I was born in 1971. At Fillmore East came out in 1971. It was a gold record before I turned 1 year old. So, they were always there. But when the music hit me, it hit me in a really, really, really big way. Since then, no lie, since about 1992-3, I have not gone a week of my life, probably not a day, without listening to something Allman Brothers related. I am not unbiased. I find this band to be one of the greatest of all time, wholly original music that's uniquely theirs. I call it American music because it's got all of these various strains of American music and culture throughout it. The history, though, is what really brought this story alive to me, and that's what we'll talk a little bit today. I have spent my life making meaning from the South's past. I find the Allman Brothers Band to be a very rich well of Southern history. Their story, their music, their inherent Southernness relates to me. The Allman Brothers Band built their aesthetic on excellence in the moment. They called it a term, and it's in the book, it's called hitting the note. And it's the central focus of my book, Play All Night. It's a story of musical virtuosity with intense tragedy and multiple rebirths. In 1998, I wrote down a list of goals. I have literally accomplished every goal that I wrote down at that time. When I went into this task, 3 of these 4 goals I had not accomplished. Write a book on the Allman Brothers, PhD in history, learn to play slide guitar. So 2014, I learned to play slide guitar. I got the PhD in history in 2018 and published the book in 2022. So I had made this list of goals, and people say, where'd you come up with this, right? Why did you think about writing a book on the Allman Brothers? This is no lie. I told you, I loved the Allman Brothers. Like their story, all that Southern Gothic stuff that you saw. Duane Allman died in a motorcycle. How much more rock and roll can you get, right? You die in a motorcycle accident and your band keeps going and does successful, and they pay all this homage to him, and it just was there. And here's the thing. I read a review of another book, the book I quoted earlier, actually, a book I loved about the Allman Brothers Band. And this fellow historian hated that book. And he hated the book because he said it didn't answer the why. And so that is what I thought about early on. Can I do that? 1998, 99, I started thinking about it. My mother died in 2012. My father died in 2014, and that got me back into graduate school. I studied under Van West, same person Dr. Mielnik studied under out at MTSU. And my job was then to turn a PhD dissertation, 500 pages, into a book, 250 pages or so. I went from 144,000 words to 85,000 words. I did that during the pandemic. I don't know that I would recommend such a grueling existential process of crisis. My challenge was how to put all of this that I just gave you into some sort of context, into a book that mattered, something that people read. My dissertation was a big, giant bunch of text, everything I could think of writing. The book, I had to consider Duane Allman and the Allman Brothers Band in a new way. It wasn't just about what I liked and what I heard and felt, although that's pretty important, but how does that manifest itself into a story that other people are interested in? What did Duane want to do? What did they want to do and accomplish in music, and how do we know if they accomplished it? That was the task. That the reason we know that Duane Allman, what he wanted to do, and how we know he was successful is this record right here, at least according to my book. This record breaking was the key for them. And that's what is the central premise of the book is Duane Allman, from the time he was here in Castle Heights, all the way until the day he died, trying to find his place in the music industry with this unique blend of music and musical talents that didn't fit on a 45 record single. Look, that record there is 4 sides. 2 sides are 1 song. They went on and on and on and on. Some of us love that. I love it. Some people get a little bit bored. But that is not, a 22-minute song is not something that gets played on AM radio, which is what would typically sell the records. That they put out this record with all of that on it, and it was successful, validated the path that Duane and his bandmates had gone on. It's a very carefully curated document. And the book is why, my book is why this record is so important to that band. And I've kind of touched on it a little bit, why its success matters today. I'm going to back up a second and talk about 5 factors that make up this story. Duane Allman himself, a book, in this case, centers around the one character. Duane founded the Allman Brothers Band. I'll get to that in 2 seconds. The South. This is absolutely essential to the story. Understanding the South and the fact that they didn't want to leave. His bandmates, he had to find support in the music industry. And finally, he had to find fans. Without fans, music, art, well, not art. Let's talk about music. Without people consuming the music, buying it, and or attending, the music is really an internal thing only, right? Like they have to share it with others who share the joy in a manner that works. From an economic perspective, it's a strange thing to say about art, but that is in fact what it is. So let me tell you a little bit about Duane Allman. And whereas this is Duane here. Whereas when Gregg cried when his mother left at age 8, Duane apparently stood there very stoically. According to Gregg Allman, he was only like 13 months older than me, but he might have been 20 years older. He was always the leader of the two, was the father figure as they went through. He's a very passionate, fiery, intense player. He died at 24. And Alexa was mentioning my CV. Like, he has a CV that is worthy of a lifetime of playing. And he only was a professional musician for a span, a recording musician for the span of about 3 years. It's pretty remarkable. A 7-disc box set that his daughter put out about a decade ago of the breadth of his stuff outside of the 4 records he recorded with the Allman Brothers Band. Duane was very inclusive. He was a leader. He also understood this one key concept that I think is very important in music. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, that's true about teamwork too, right? And I think a lot about bands like in similar fashion to athletic teams, basically basketball. A good basketball team that's moving and flowing is passing the ball, they're rebounding, everything is sort of going in flow. When one person zigs, the other zag. And that's what the Allman Brothers Band did. And he insisted on that. He valued improvisation and intentionality. And the term hitting the note that I mentioned earlier, this is the only people I've ever heard use this term is in the Allman Brother world. But it makes a lot of sense. He says hitting the note is hitting your peak, hitting the place where we all like to be at. When you start hitting and this like that, the communication between the members of the band gets wide open. Stuff starts coming out everywhere. And we mentioned the South before. The American South is really where the setting for this story is. So Nashville is where the Allman Brothers were born, and they also spent some time here, as we mentioned, in Lebanon. Couldn't figure out how to put Lebanon and Nashville on the map together. So just please know that this is Lebanon also, okay? They more or less grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida. In fact, their mother lived there until she died like 10 years ago in this little tiny house. They had separate stints. Number 3 actually is St. Louis. They spent time, this is Muscle Shoals, Alabama, Macon, Georgia, where they ended up. And then Jacksonville, Florida is where they formed. For the most part, these are the small, except for Nashville, really, and Jacksonville, these are small town, it's a small town Southern story. These are suburban towns often near federal infrastructure, military, NASA, the TVA. And because these jobs bring, these federal jobs and the things that go along with them bring people to the area, cultures end up merging and mixing. And that's the Southern culture of music that the Allman Brothers are inheritors of. One of the key moments in Allman Brother history, in March of 1969, all but Gregg, who's pointing here, the 5 of them, got together in a house not too dissimilar from this one and had this epic jam, 3 hours, 2 drummers, 2 guitarists, bass player. Gregg wasn't there yet. And when they finished this jam, Duane stood in the doorway and said, anybody in here not going to play in my band is going to have to fight your way out. And that became the Allman Brothers Band. So let me tell you about that group, because Gregg isn't here yet. Gregg is actually out in LA. Of this group, though, 6 guys, Duane, Gregg, and that's J-Mo, J. Johnny Johnson, were all seasoned rhythm and blues players. In fact, J-Mo, J. Johnny Johnson, had also backed Otis Redding. J-Mo was also steeped in jazz. Now, Barry Oakley, bass player, originally from Chicago, moved down to Florida and really adopted a Southern attitude. He started speaking like a Southerner, really was a Southerner once he transplanted down here. Barry Oakley and then Dickie Betts, these two were partners in a band in Florida that played electric blues. Dickie Betts, who just passed away earlier this year, Dickie loved blues. He loved bluegrass. He loved country music, what he called string music. He grew up playing, not bluegrass. He said, we didn't call it bluegrass. It was string music. Anybody remember that or know that of your families would sit around and play maybe on a Saturday or a Sunday? Dickie has lots of stories about that in his life. Butch Trucks was a folk artist, actually a folk drummer, who also loved classical music. All of them grew up playing rhythm and blues. And these bandmates push musical boundaries. Now, Dickie Betts, this is the thing I mentioned, Duane being a leader, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Duane was, like I said, the greatest, known as being one of the greatest out there. And one of his first moves when he formed a band was to get a second guitarist who was every bit as good as him and give him time. Barry Oakley played what you would call lead bass. Bass can be a real simple pocket instrument. You stay home, you're holding everything together. But when you listen to the Allman Brothers Band, it's called the lead bass. It just keeps going. Those of you who play music would know. There's two drummers, totally unique in rock and roll, totally unique, period. It's hard enough to find one drummer who can do it. 40 years playing music, it's hard enough to find a single drummer. Gregg Allman really tops it all off. He had played the organ, Hammond B3, was a singer, the best looking dude in the band for sure. He was a sex symbol for a number of years. Duane was the star, and the group is the benefactor and heir to this Southern musical tradition. They've got one foot kind of firmly rooted in the past: blues, jazz, rhythm and blues, rock and roll. But then they've got another one firmly in the present where they're playing really contemporary American music. It's improvisational, which means, and this is true, you listen to any Allman Brothers live recording, every one of them is different. The basic song form is the same. Every one of them is different. That's just like John Coltrane. That's just like Miles Davis. That's just like Pharoah Sanders. Improvisation was their key. Just like me right now, I'm playing off of y'all. I'm looking at your faces. I'm seeing those of you guys who nod to me. I know when I say something that hits because you react, and I might lean in more, whether you know that or not, right? If I'm playing with a band, watch bands. I love to do this. Watch what goes on behind what's going on. Watch how they interact with each other. That's what these guys did all the time. You go to a 3-hour show, and that's what's happening all the time. Now, I mentioned before the music industry is important. Prior to the digital revolution, I don't need to explain to y'all really why records were important, right? Or the radio was. I think every one of us grew up in that generation, right? When I talk to my kids, they don't get that. And I'm not saying that to say, young people, they don't know anything, blah, blah, blah. They don't understand the importance of the physical product media that put money in the pocket of the record industry that eventually makes its way down to the artist. Now, Duane had 3 different stints at success. They tried in New York in 1965. They came here in 1966, Nashville. 1967, they went out to LA. And by 1968, Duane quit, and he went down to Muscle Shoals, and that's where he really got his start. Now, the problem was that each had record labels that were not interested in this improvisational, hitting the note, whole is greater, contemporary music with a lot of older or heritage leanings in it. It didn't work real well until he found Phil Walden. Phil Walden's from Macon, Georgia. That's why the Allman Brothers were based in Macon. He was the impresario there. Founded a company called Capricorn Records, specifically as Duane's creative outlet. He had been Otis Redding's manager when Otis was killed in the plane crash, and was specifically looking to get into what he called white rock and roll. He was having problems with the rhythm and blues artists as a white manager there. He founded Capricorn Records. This gentleman's Frank Fenter, who served as his deputy for years. The greatest legacy really that they had was moving Southern music to the forefront. Before Walden, bands like the Allman Brothers were forced to leave the South to succeed. And Duane Allman and his bandmates did not want to leave the South. There was something about living here that was very conducive to their musical melange, to their life, and it worked for them. In fact, frankly, once Duane got south, that's when he became who we know today. Bets, sticky bets. We fought tooth and nail to prevent Atlantic, that was the big record company, from moving us out of the South when they said we'd never make it living in Macon, Georgia and playing our type of music. The South was its home. That's where they found their first audience among their people. Now, I want to say real quick, there's issues here. Phil Walden is their manager. He owns their record company. He manages their publishing and their booking. The co-owner of the record company actually owns their subsidiary of Atlantic Records, so they've got that mixed in there too. And Wexler was making some decisions that might have been best for him, but not necessarily for the band. And of course, Walden might have been making those decisions, and he was, and he basically got caught. By 1979, Capricorn filed for bankruptcy. The Allman Brothers had sued him, but we're still in 1970, 71 when I'm talking right now. Things got to be a problem, but they were not a problem back in the early days. I stayed out of this in the book, by the way. I barely touch it because it bores me a little bit, and it's been done really well. There's a lot of back and forth with lawyers and court cases and stuff, and I'm just like, no, what about the music? How does it impact the music? Now, the final piece of this I mentioned before is the audience, and what I always say is, without us, what does it matter? And right, because I play a lot of music. I just play it in my basement. Nobody hears me, right? So it's just for me. These are artists who are looking to make music bigger than them and for other people. And I want to use a quote. Greil Marcus is one of the more famous rock critics of his time. No artist can predict, let alone control, what an audience will make of his images. Yet no rock and roller can exist without a relationship with his audience. The best popular artists create immediate links between people who might have nothing in common but a response to their work. That's the gist of my book. I wanted to find something new to say about the Allman Brothers Band. And there's plenty of that out there about this particular band. There were several. By the time I wrote my book, I was worried that I had missed my chance because other books kept coming out on the subject. But nobody really touched this particular piece, how audiences reacted to the band. And my link is, did audiences hear or express that they heard what the band said they wanted to do? And how do you know that? Basically, what I did is I combed the archives like nobody's business. I did so much research on this. I'm amazed actually at how much I ended up compiling. One of the greatest treasures in research is the fact that student newspapers of colleges got digitized. The National Endowment for the Humanities paid a big, they were granting money, and then the institutions had to support that to digitize these newspapers. I literally sat in my house in Franklin, Tennessee, and I looked up University of California, Santa Barbara, University of Texas at Austin, MTSU's sidelines, all of these things. The best thing was, Allman is a very unique name in 1969 to like 70, 71. There is an Allman that played for Penn State University. Actually, I found that in the Penn State papers. And then there was like a Gregg Allman who was like an Eagle Scout somewhere. And what my take was exactly that. The Allman Brothers said, we want to play music like this that makes the audience feel like we feel when we play it. And that's exactly what the audience said. It's called reception theory. It's what the audience's reaction was. And that's the bulk of the book. The bulk of the book is explaining going up to the point of recording this particular record. When they were not successful, they were talking about breaking up the band. What were audiences saying? And they dug them. But people weren't buying the records, right? That's the key at this era, is that tangible media. They liked the band. They loved the records. They loved the concerts. So the other books on the band that had come out before me was really focused on, a lot of the tragedy of the story. Duane Allman and Barry Oakley, the founding guitarist and the founding bassist of the Allman Brothers Band, were both killed in motorcycle accidents in 1971 and then 72. That's Barry Oakley there. And I've done enough of Duane around here. There's Duane there. They were both killed in motorcycle accidents. Seriously, eerily, in almost the same spot. They were like 5 blocks apart where they were both killed. But the story ends really just as it's beginning. Duane and the band get notice that At Fillmore East has hit gold, 500,000 copies in about 6 weeks. They hadn't sold but about 125,000 units in 2 years of their previous 2 records. He gets notice. He goes off, dies in this pretty tragic motorcycle crash. And then Barry, again, they go out as a quintet, craziest scenario that really just us nerds will really nerd out over, but they go out as this 5-man band and have this massive tour. And at the end of that, as they're recording, actually, Ramblin' Man, you guys probably know that song, many of you do. Barry gets on his motorcycle and he dies. So what has happened is, right, the story ends really as it begins. In 1973, they put out a record called Brothers and Sisters. That's a record with Ramblin' Man. It was a #1 record. Ramblin' Man was a #2 hit, their only top 10 hit, massive hit. And all of that happened after really 2 of their core founding members, including their founder and their star, and the sun around which all of this orbited, died. And that's my next piece to this book, as well as to the work that I do, because his bandmates followed this model for 43 years after his death. And I'm going to say it's pretty remarkable. Most of the time when you lose that leader in a band or in an artistic endeavor, that's pretty much it. People pick up the pieces and start over. But the reason why it worked is because Duane had a vision. He pulled together people who could fulfill that vision, and they fulfilled it. And they were so struck by that they carried that with them for the rest of their lives. 4 original members who lived. I want to share a little piece about Duane. This was something he wrote in his diary in 1969, January 1. This will give you an example of the dude. This year I will be more thoughtful of my fellow man, exert more effort in each of my endeavors professionally as well as personally, take love wherever I find it, and offer it to everyone who will take it. In this coming year, I will seek knowledge from those wiser than me and try to teach those who wish to learn from me. I love being alive, and I will be the best man I possibly can. Now, Duane's musical vision was improvisation, ensemble playing, musical excellence, and live music experience. He was less concerned with commercial hits. He loved the communal aspect of music making, and he felt like audiences were vital to that mix. He had bandmates who pushed him to be his creative best. He had record company support. They worked relentlessly, 300 days on the road for more than 2 years. 300 days on the road for more than 2 years. Now that destroyed families and it destroyed lives. That is rock and roll. Another reason I stayed out of the family stuff in my book. I stayed completely out of drugs. I stayed completely out of the finances. And Cher barely makes a mention in the book. And not because she's not important, but I really do have a bias about place as a way to understand the past. In February of 2021, I holed up in an Airbnb in Macon and began the final manuscript. That was my first time I left the house in almost a year, right? I mean, we all left in 2020, but I went somewhere else and was there for a while. The following year, March 29th, this was the 50th anniversary of Duane's death, the following October. I was in Muscle Shoals writing this book. And it was the eeriest thing because I'm writing the book and I get to this passage about Duane dying and I realize it was 50 years to that day. I was in the place where it all started for him, which was Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Now, to me, whenever I think about place, I think about Beatty Road, which is actually named after my family. This is in Babson Park, Florida, where my father grew up. And I also think about the Wilson Dam in Muscle Shoals, which is why the music industry ends up growing out of Muscle Shoals, is because of all of the activity going on around there. I listen to a lot of a band called the Drive-By Truckers, and Patterson Hood's dad actually played a lot with Duane. David Hood played a lot with Duane on studio sessions in Muscle Shoals. And really, they're one of the most important Southern bands of my generation. One of the things they talk about is called the duality of the Southern thing. And this is something I've long struggled with, and I'm in a room full of people who live in the South. I don't know how many of you identify as Southerners. But how can this region that's given the world such beauty and cooperation and music is so casually accepting of the long tail of racism in Southern life? I'm a Southerner as much by upbringing as geography. I only attended integrated schools, though I was taught to be fearful of black students. I'm a Southerner who grew up in a small beach town in South Florida and was raised with a reverence for my Southern ancestors, including Confederates. I'm a Southerner who made his bones in history in the land of Mickey Mouse, Orlando, Florida. I'm a Southerner who currently lives in Nashville. And I'm a Southerner who chooses to celebrate the culture that overcomes the racism through music and art, as I find art culture to be the very best of the South. One thing I want y'all to notice, if you look at this picture closely, 5 of 6 people are pretty much looking at the soloist now. That's what I mean about paying attention to what's going on around the band. They're not just sitting there playing their parts, but they're actually actively participating with this. This is framed on my wall. It's actually got a copy of it in the book. Duane's legacy is about intent. It's about improvisation, the live experience, the whole being greater. It's original music. It's a musical conversation and a musical family that he developed that blazed a path that people are still following to this day and selling out. As you read the book, as you ponder this story, I want you to think about things like leadership and collaboration. The amount of details and how I weave details into the story is something worth paying attention to, I hope, the way I wove this story. Also, this is a story about the Southern counterculture as well as the national counterculture. We're from the South. We know we're sometimes a little bit behind when it comes to these progressive big trends. Sometimes it's an understatement. And I mean that with a lot of love and respect. This is my home. This is where I grew up. These are my people. But the hippie movement starts a good 5-6 years before it got here. And frankly, I skipped over all of the stories about the danger they had traveling with long hair and with a black dude in the band. I completely skipped over that because that could be a whole talk in and of itself. But the story here really is a person, a vision that outlived him for 43 years and really still does today. He's not here. The band is no longer playing, but the Allman Brothers do still influence. And you can talk to any young musician, rock or country, and they have all been touched by the Allman Brothers. And I've probably gone past time. All right, look at that. In fact, it tracks throughout the story. It was a model. Barry Oakley in particular was paying a lot of attention to what was going on, but the real difference is that the Grateful Dead are kind of from a folk jug band background, and the Allman Brothers have this really heavy blues background. But no, very similar aesthetic, very similar model. I have this one passage in the book. It was one of my big breakthroughs. Was when I wrote about Phil Lesh, the Grateful Dead's bass player, playing Dark Star on an album called Live Dead. And as I was listening to it, I was like, oh my God, that's what Barry does. And I basically, if you get to that paragraph, there's like 2 of them that I made up. Like I was like, you know, that inspiration you get, anybody knows it, right? I had to stop. I was writing it on sticky notes and it turned out like I was pretty proud of it. But no, absolutely. The Barnstorm, the Caravan, the fact that audience is so much a part of what you do. The live experience is the experience, right? The Allman Brothers would say when they play at Fillmore East, turn the lights off. Just put a spotlight on the disco ball. We just want you to feel the music. Close your eyes and feel the music. And the Dead were the exact same way. So no, very, very similar paths. And they both played at Watkins Glen in 1973 for 600,000 people. The largest concert at that time in history ever. And the Allman Brothers closed it. They were the top band at the time. So I thank you guys. Thanks for sticking it out. Everybody stayed awake too. Whoa.